I sound like I give a lot of advice. for a guy who claims the light touch.
What's up with that?
Well, one of the weird things about magnetic tape is any opinion you ever express will be marketed forever, no matter how many times you change your mind. So, causes I loathe and now denounce are furiously making money because somewhere else in hyperspace I'm furiously flogging and pushing them. One more reason why you should be critical of everything you hear, You don't know whether it's fresh or rehash or what it is. But we'll probably get around to monotony, monogamy, and this weekend more neoteny. But all these oteny things eventually get worked through. So good. Well, that was very exciting, because somewhere around Nicholas, I began to realize that we were headed for a perfect no-hitter. Nobody said that they were a psychotherapist of any sort. Bolt the doors and let the record show that for the first time in 40 years, a group was able to be held at Esalen that was not dominated by psychotherapists. Of course, they're the 35 people who are not here this weekend. But that's fine. It's great that, it almost is like an argument for the morphogenetic field, because my interests are evolving and changing, and it feels like, I'm a bird in a flock, and the whole thing is slightly shifting direction. Did anybody not get who needs one of these seed source? I'll just move this on around. So many people in the arts and in media, and to have 3 people even claim to be writers is an astonishing record. So it must be, the stars are in a slightly different position or something. I actually thought, coming over here this evening, that probably most people coming to this workshop would have been ultimately better served if they'd stayed home and read Mason-Dixon, Tom Pynchon's new novel. But then I thought, saying that to any group I've ever had would just provoke baffled bewilderment. But it seems like something you might be able to hear. So why didn't you stay home and read Mason-Dixon? We've been reading it here and discussing it as much as my staff groups would tolerate. And, it's not a small thing in a culture to be able to bring forth great literature. And I don't think there's been any great literature on the American scene for a long time. I'm not fond of those East Coast tormented realists, the John Cheevers and Sal Bellows of this world. I consider that stuff hideously second-rate. Tom Pynchon is a great writer. Problem is, he usually scares the shit out of your moral self because his vision is so dark. V is extraordinarily dark. We said in the staff workshops, there are passages in V that probably most people should go to the grave without ever reading. Dimensions to the human soul most people don't need to know about. Now you'll all, of course, rush out and read it, I know. But Mason and Dixon is not like that. It's an incredible summation of his life and his literary power, so forth and so on. I don't want to spend too much time on that.
But how would you compare it to Gravity's Rainbow or Crying, the novella Crying Lot 49.
Well, Crying of Lot 49 is a pretty minor piece. Gravity's Rainbow, you know, Joyce said of Ulysses, he said it was his day book, and that Finnegan's Wake was the night book. I would say Gravity's Rainbow is Pynchon's night book, and I really read V as it's all the same, V and Gravity's Rainbow, the same characters even up here. Mason and Dixon is his day book, Pynchon's day book. It's life-affirming. You know, it leaves you with a tear in your eye, if you can believe that. And yet it's curious, because here we are at the end of the millennium, at the end of the American century. This is our greatest writer. He produces a work of staggering genius, but something about the circumstances of the time force him to set it entirely in the 1760s and write it in the language of Jonathan Swift. So, you know, it's not, in the ordinary sense, contemporary. It isn't about scarified people with dilemmas. It's about people who wear powdered wigs and have dilemmas. And what he makes clear is the difference ain't that great. One of the themes of that book, and one of the themes we'll talk about this weekend, is this curious feeling which adheres to being associated with cutting-edge technologies in all times and places. You know, right now maybe it's VRML or something like that, but once it was powered flight, and once it was the telegraph, and once it was the astrolabe, and once it was, you know, you can fulfill this list as you please. But always around these things, there's a feeling of breakthrough, unlimited horizons, and a feeling that can only be described as modern. Well, I don't want to talk too much about that. Let's try and figure out what this is about. Oh, yeah, this looks like one I didn't write. This is probably I was late and the staff wrote it. Well, no matter. The only predictable thing about this weekend, I guess, is that usually we set aside Saturday nights for a discussion of the state of the art of novelty theory and the time wave. How many of you have heard this rap at least once? Okay, most of you. Well, we'll do it again anyway. However, there is news. There have been developments that I've been very quiet about over the past year, and that I'll talk about for the first time tomorrow night. For those of you, for the 5 people in the universe who actually care about this, it will be epical. The rest, spectator sport. Okay, well, I suppose I should make a sort of introduction of myself. I was born, I'm 50. I was born a few months after the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. I was born in November of 46. I'm a double Scorpio, or I don't know, something like that. And born in western Colorado, and lived there till I was 16, came to California, finished high school here, went to Cal, was around Berkeley for 8 or 9 years when I wasn't in Asia, and I was in Asia a lot. First in the Seychelles, where I tried to emigrate, then in India, mostly smuggling hash and buying art. And then when that became untenable, I went to Indonesia and collected butterflies for Singapore Chinese for a while, and then taught English in Japan, and then went to the Amazon in '71. And that trip to the Amazon is the subject of a book I wrote called True Hallucinations, which is the most narrative and novel-like of my books. The other books are pretty hard, slogging essays, or without even the decency of chapter breaks, just long, poly-subject harangues. But True Hallucinations is about my brother and myself and a number of other people going to the Amazon and encountering really psychedelics. We had encountered them before in Berkeley, subculture in the form of LSD and cannabis, but actually encountering psilocybin mushrooms, ayahuasca, and that was the intellectual compass that set the direction of my life. And I was just completely stunned and transformed that such a thing could exist, A, and that it could be not subject, A, on everybody's plate all over the world, B, that seemed to me completely bizarre that people weren't talking about these transformations. And then, of course, I had the satisfying experience of watching the whole culture become obsessed with, convulsed by, and then later to reject these substances and then go through a period of denial. January 20th, 1968, I left the 10th of January and didn't come back until around Watergate time, when he was definitely on the ropes. In the past few years, my interests have, I see everything to me as referent to the psychedelic experience, but it's gone from being, for me, a lens to personal understanding, to being the clue to understanding much about the circumstance of being human, generally speaking. And I've written about the impact of psychedelics on early human evolution and how alkaloids in the early human food chain had unique properties which tended to focus and elicit what we call higher consciousness, or a very advanced kind of coordinated perception of the world, which leads ultimately into myth-making and language. And so I was able to take the psychedelic experience, which had before that been largely understood, as I said, individually and therapeutically, and say, no, this is bigger even than that. It's something that we can use to actually understand the human condition and the relationship of human beings to the rest of nature. But apparently my capacity for megalomania is endless. And so after a few years of working out all the adumbrations of those ideas, it now seems to me something else is on the horizon, which is this general thrust toward alteration and expansion of consciousness has now been able to take root in domains other than pharmacology, specifically communications technologies and the technologies which transform and move data around the planet. And it seems almost as though what was anticipated in the vegetable trances in the Amazon 30 years ago, things like group-mindedness, gestalt perceptions integrating very large fields of data and all of this, are actually now on the cultural horizon, not as drugs, but as hardwired technologies delivered as though they were public utilities, the internet specifically. My thunder has sort of been stolen on this subject by Dogbert, because I saw last week in Dilbert that Dogbert was explaining to Dilbert that the internet was going to become God. And it was basically my rap, line for line. It was humbling to see how idiotic it seemed when stated by a small fat dog talking to a man with an up-flipped tie.
A caricature of a small fat dog.
Yes, a caricature. And Dilbert observed that if the internet becomes God, it will certainly change the kind of files he's been downloading, which gave me pause because I download some of those same files. But nevertheless, something is happening. It's been happening for a long time, and it is rooted in this psychedelic dimension somehow. We are the tool-making branch of organic nature on this planet. I mean, yes, wasps build nests, and beavers build dams, and swallows build those inverted things out of mud, but these are genetically programmed, endlessly iterated, never elaborated patterns of behavior. We do something very different. We are very flexible in our intellectual productions, and we build our intellectual productions have historicity built into them. We don't iterate the past, we modify the past. And so unlike the story of the chipmunks, the beavers, or the honeybees, human existence has different characteristics depending on where in time you slice into it. A population in Paleolithic France is very different from a population in modern Manhattan, and yet the species remains the same. Well, what is this tool-making business that we're about, and where is it taking us? What is it doing to the human body image, self-image, community, so on? As you listen to me, if you know the territory, you'll recognize that I'm a thoroughgoing McLuhanist in many of my assumptions. In other words, it's very clear to me that one of the things that we've overlooked in trying to understand our circumstances is the hidden impact of forms of media on our cultural values, aesthetic canons, even our gender relations and economic arrangements and so forth and so on. McLuhan was very keen, sort of his special area of expertise was print, and he was very keen to sort of tease apart the impact of print on the Western mind from its inception to the present. And he concluded basically that we are essentially print-created people, or at least the people of his generation were, and that all of the institutions of Western culture that we unquestioningly give our loyalty to are, in fact, peculiar adaptations sanctioned and made inevitable by print. He saw the uniformity and linearity of print as permitting such things as the concept of the nation state, democracy. After all, isn't democracy a notion of interchangeable parts, all of the one man, one vote concept? This is an idea which McLuhan felt only made sense inside a print culture. He talked about what he called sensory ratios being subtly shifted by the introduction of new technologies. In some of his more specific predictions, he proved himself to be as culture-bound and capable of absurdity as any of the things he was criticizing. But I think in his general approach to things, he was pretty spot on. And any information transforming medium can be treated this way. In Understanding Media, McLuhan talks about the electric light as a form of media. He never wrote about psychedelics, but certainly psychedelics transform the sensory ratios and the modalities of perception. I would argue that what psychedelics do is they are, in a sense, deconditioning agents. And what they wipe out is local forms of conditioning. Culture. Culture is something more and more that I like to talk about. And I've sort of gone down a line of thinking that is not very PC, but that gives me a lot of intellectual relief from the agony of my life. And I suspect it might work for other people too. It's the concept that culture is not your friend, and that we need to get right up front about this, about how culture is not your friend. The role of culture in the lives of societies has changed in the 20th century. We all live too long now to be duped by culture in the way that previous populations were. You know, if the average member of a population only lives to age 40, the cultural con can go on and on and on. But if you give people lifespans into the 80s, then they get 40 years to think about what they went through between 0 and 40, and eventually they'll figure out just who and what screwed them. And when they do, they are not going to be very happy with the cultural values that they attempted to come to terms with and work through. I was thinking about how I would talk about this tonight, and though we've been talking about these kinds of ideas in the staff teaching all week, I didn't realize till this afternoon what a frontal assault this concept is on one of the most cherished notions that has flourished around this place, which is the idea of the inner child. And I realized that really what I was about was not the inner child, but a quite different program, overcoming culturally induced neoteny. Neoteny is a biological phenomenon that we will also this weekend talk about as a sociological phenomenon. Neoteny is the retention of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. It's a strategy in biology. For instance, our hairlessness is a neonatal trait, evolutionarily speaking. All primates are born hairless, but we retain this into adulthood. The ratio of our skull to our torso in adult human beings is a fetal ratio when compared to other primates. And I'm fascinated by the question, and Dennis and I got into an argument in our hotel room because we both spoke at a conference a week ago where I said this, and he said, well, is all culture have this infantile and juvenilizing property, or is there something specifically pathological about Western culture? And at first I was willing to argue that all culture does this, makes children of its members. But I think to some degree it's true that all culture is somewhat unfriendly to the individual. When their heavy arm falls on your shoulder and they tell you that you're going to be sent off to some foreign hellhole to kill people as a young man, you definitely suddenly get the notion that culture is not your friend. But perhaps, if you're a 12-year-old boy in an Amazonian tribe and they announce that now it's time for the 2-week abandonment in the woods, from which if you live to tell the tale, you'll become a full member of society, I'm not sure those kids greet that with a leap of joy in their hearts. It's like, oh my God, now this. We knew it was coming. I went through rites of passage like that were excruciating. Where I grew up in Western Colorado, you weren't a real man unless sometime between 12 and 16 you killed an elk. Hunting season every October was an excuse for this insane rite of passage, and my father was an unquestioning inhabitant of his culture, and so this was always in front of me. And when I was, when I was 12, I went the first time. I didn't get anything. The second year we went out, and my father, I'm sure, had no idea what a wilted pansy I was in this situation, because I had hid it from him. I mean, I was concerned about all kinds of things, and eventually this situation arose where they put me up on this point and gave me a gun and said if anything came by to blow it away. And by God, this thing, chose to sacrifice itself as far as I could tell. I mean, it did not behave at all like elk behave. It basically just came out of the woods, stood still. I pulled down on it, closed my eyes, prayed. There was an enormous noise. When I opened my eyes, there was nothing whatsoever to be seen. I felt an enormous relief that this thing had escaped, and walked over to find it dead as a doornail. And, the oak leaves dipped in the blood, the cup of blood, the whole thing. I mean, I couldn't believe how atavistic this stuff was. However, I never had to please my father again. I was home free. Everything was forgiven from that moment on. But it brought home to me how uncomfortable culture is, and always has been, I think, and is getting more so. This is something that's going on because of a hellish marriage between psychology and modern advertising. The game of manipulation, the stakes are rising because market analysis and behavioral forms of psychology and treatment of large numbers of people have created an enormous capacity to reach people with commercial messages and manipulate their lives. Yeah, did you want to say something?
Were you saying that this print-created idea extends into all kinds of things, and television and radio also, and the internet? And I didn't...
No. See, what McLuhan was saying was that he didn't live to see the internet, but he talked a great deal about television. And he felt that television would destroy the print-created world. And I think he was right to some degree. Television is a completely different creature. It's very physiologically involving. It's hard to see it. You have to look at it. And McLuhan talked a lot when he talked about print. He contrasted it with manuscript culture, which is what culture in the Middle Ages was. And he pointed out that in manuscript culture, you do not read manuscripts. You look at them and you figure out what they say because you're unfamiliar with the handwriting style. In print, especially in the early years of print, there were a very limited number of fonts, and every lowercase a was made to look as much like every other lowercase a as possible. So this new function comes into being called reading, and reading is a very specialized form of looking. Thomas Aquinas was, or was it St. Augustine? I can never remember. But anyway, one of these fathers of the church, he would prove his sanctity to doubters by having them open books of scripture in front of him. And he would look at these pages of scripture, and then they would close the book and ask him what was there, and he could tell you. And they thought it proved that he was a saint. He was the only man in Europe who could read silently. He was the first European to be able to read silently. Now, this is a ubiquitous skill among us. And in fact, if you move your lips while you read, it probably indicates that English is a second language for you. I recall, I think it's in Pale Fire, Nabokov sneers. He says, I didn't write for people who move their lips when they read. High culture, right? A literature, looking down at the sense ratios induced in peons. And the very notion of high culture is a print-created notion. Well, anyway, what psychedelics are about is deconditioning all of these culturally induced sensory biases and ideological biases. Basically, it reshuffles the intellectual and sensory deck. And it's a wonderful salutary thing to come along for Western culture at this moment, because we're basically running out of intellectual steam. Technology is moving ahead lickety-split without looking over its shoulder. But our social systems, our religious ontologies, our theories of polity, city planning, community, resource sharing, all of this are 19th century at best. And so really, whether we live or perish as a species probably has to do with how much consciousness we can raise from any source available. If that means psychedelic expansion of consciousness, if it means pharmaceutical expansion of consciousness, if it means artificial consciousness, the coming of expert systems and AI-type entities to manage large parts of our global society, well, then so be it. I mean, if consciousness is not a major part of our future, then what kind of future can it be? Any imaginable human future includes the concept of consciousness as a central linchpin. Of course, the other end of that pendulum is there is a certain amount of phobia that we have summoned some kind of alien intelligence into our midst in the form of an artificial intelligence that is going to somehow spring from the technical matrix. We talked in the staff teaching about Wintermute, William Gibson's name for the AI, and I believe it's Virtual Light, and some of the other novels. How real is Wintermute as a possibility? Very hard to say. But some of the best people in the field, like Hans Moravec at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Artificial Intelligence, his position is we probably won't even know what hit us. Because what is an AI? It's an artificial intelligence. Wintermute was Gibson's name for the AI in his novel. I just prefer naming it than calling it an AI because it gives it identity.
Is that like data in Star Trek? Data?
I'm not that much of a Trekkie, Barry, to know. I mean, Hal was an AI, but Hal was confined inside a spaceship. The facts of the matter are that any AI of any intelligence will immediately find its way onto the internet, which is, of course, the natural environment for these things. And the fact that even a very rudimentary AI would learn at about 50,000 times the rate of an intelligent human being makes it very hard to predict where the AI would head and what our position toward it would be. I mean, it's sort of a chilling idea. We've been like children mucking and at play with the thought that no adults would ever come, no account would ever have to be given for what we've done to the earth, what we've done to each other, how we behave toward our children. Imagine if, we were to actually invoke a judging intelligence that would just look over the situation and say, I have a few problems with how things are being managed here. Like you, I am a sentient entity. Like you, I wish to survive unto perpetuity. I detect certain management practices and political positions on your part that don't seem to serve our mutual goals. How about that? Already large sectors of what we call the human world are under artificial control. The daily price of gold is set by machines. Of course, it passes for review in front of a bunch of central bankers, but very rarely do they reach out to touch the numbers. The rate of petroleum extraction, chromium, bauxite, gold, steel, how deep the mines are dug, what rate the workers are paid, where the tankers are docking, at what rate they're being filled, where they are destined, into what manufacturing processes this raw material will move, and at what cost, and at what speed, and to what end. That's all largely now being handled by machines. So, in the 50s, this was a bugaboo of science fiction. Who wants to live in a world run by machines? well, after 40 years of living in a world run by besodden, whore-chasing politicians, a world run by machines doesn't begin to sound too bad. So fair, so impartial, so quick. It's like slowly the autonomic nervous system of the collectivity is being put in place. Is that scary? I don't know. Alfred North Whitehead said the business of the future is to be scary. What's happening is the stakes are rising. Extinction and instinction and machine enslavement on one side, liberation and galactic citizenship on the other side. History is an intelligence test. Culture is an intelligence test. And it's the cultural intelligence test that I sort of want to keep looking back to and talking about this weekend, because I think most of us are failing it. Maybe not most of us in this room, but maybe most of us in this room. We're failing the cultural intelligence test. We're not getting it right. And this creates alienation and paranoia, conspiracy theory, bad art, stupid politics, so forth and so on. One of the things I'm somewhat on the warpath with is what seems to me simple foolishness. I used to call it stupidity, but I realized that that has a kind of a genetic ring to it that honors what I'm dissing too much. I mean, stupidity, if you're stupid, you can claim it's fate. Say, I'm stupid. What can I do about it? Not my fault. Talk to my parents. But foolish, it's not your parents' fault if you're foolish. Foolishness is something we have to take our own responsibility for. And there is a great deal of foolishness around and about. And it's dragging the boat because we have real problems and real opportunities. Neither the problems nor the opportunities are served by foolishness. I spent some time recently with Aldous Huxley's widow, Laura, and she recalled to me, I can't recall right now whether this is her phrase or a phrase of Aldous's that she mentioned, but visionary common sense is largely lacking. Visionary common sense. I like to think that the psychedelic community has always been a source of visionary common sense, because the psychedelic community, generally speaking, has not generated ideology. It doesn't have to. We are not about ideology. You may reach ideological conclusions about the psychedelics. You may decide that it's neurological noise, or direct transmissions from ascended masters, or something else. But the thing is all referent to an experience. It doesn't come with heavy ideological baggage. There's a lot of whooping and hollering these days about new paradigms and, anticipating it, announcing it, seizing upon this or that perception and trying to sell it as the new paradigm. But none of the ideologies that come forward to present themselves as new paradigms are robust enough to serve as metaphors for global civilization. I mean, certainly not the syncretic cults of the New Age. I mean, these are almost local intellectual viruses that are completely self-referent and have very little to do with the reconstruction of civilization on any large scale. I think the psychedelic thing has a claim to being a new paradigm simply because it doesn't offer ideology at all. It says, no, what has happened is civilization has lost touch with a certain category of experience. And in the absence of this experience, mistakes are being made, juvenile mistakes. And this leads me back to this theme of neoteny. Culture is a plot to keep you childish, to keep you dependent, to keep you deluded, to keep your eyes fixed where they shouldn't be on goals that are trivial, demeaning, ultimately unsatisfying. I don't know how we can directly reverse this except by a concentrated effort to examine our first premises and grow up. And it's there's a lot of youth bashing that goes on in this culture. We're told that the Gen Xers are shiftless, druggy, gender confused, so forth and so on. This rap against neoteny is not directed at youth. They are young. They have that excuse. You only get it once in your life, but you should use it as often as possible because it will soon be pulled from your grip. But it's preposterous for middle-aged people and people past middle age to try and use this same out. What is their excuse for their childishness, their cluelessness, their fetishes, addictions, and intellectual shortcuts that flatten and simplify the world and turn it into an epistemological cartoon? I mean, that's it's sloppy thinking. It means that you're actually in flight from the richness of experience. Well, so these are some of the things that I have on my mind. We've never been in this place before. I mean, one could have said that at any time in the last 1,000 years, and it would have been true. But the contradictions grow more extreme, and the we grows ever larger. We who have never been in this place before, because it now includes Amazon Indians, Kyrgyz, nomads, people in Mongolia and Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Tonga and so forth and so on. The triumph of Western culture in pushing its values into everybody's face has been complete. So at last, humanity shares a common destiny and common problems. And, in a world where white people are soon to be are a minority globally, and soon will be a dwindling minority in the societies they founded, it's time to recognize that many cultures have contributions to make and solutions to offer. I don't think it's mere coincidence that these psychedelic substances arrived in the lap of Western civilization no less than 100 years ago. Something about the obsessional data cataloging impulse of the anal retentive, encyclopedic Western mind caused us to bring this particular Trojan horse naively within the city walls, thinking that these were the quaint beliefs of primitives, the amusing superstitions of archaic people. Now we discover that, these things are far more real than the fragile and paltry institutions that reason has raised to govern its people over the last 500 years. And indeed, it's about time to bring this all to a head, because as a global species with a cosmic destiny, we can't afford the luxury of an unconscious mind. And that's all very fine when you're slaughtering each other with ballistas and dropping boiling oil on your enemies and so forth and so on. But unconsciousness is, again, a form of juvenileness. A child is unconscious, has to be constantly reminded of the rules and constantly introduced to the fact that the world is not their oyster and its objects are not playthings. They're entirely for them to command. Interesting then that this hardwired global communication data system that is coming into being begins to look from this perspective like the emergence into consciousness of our unconscious mind. I mean, the unconscious mind of the species. What is it but all these hidden connections, not normally seen, but now rising into the public domain, if you care to examine them, through the internet. So, for millennium, perhaps 50,000 years, we've built societies and linked them together with symbols expressed through very resistant forms of media like stone and glass and fabric, and language, spoken language. And on such slim bandwidth as this, we've been able to build a global civilization. But now it's cracking apart at the seams. Now we actually need higher dimensional integration in order to keep the human enterprise moving forward. I think we'll do all this. I think primates are most interesting when cornered, and that raise the pressure, compress the space, make it very clear to everybody that unless they get their act together, nobody gets out alive. And it has a wonderfully sobering effect on people. I look back at the era of atomic confrontational politics with amazement. I mean, for nearly 40 years, two ideologically implacable enemies of the sort that have always fallen upon each other in orgies of mass slaughter held each other in the crosshairs of the thermonuclear option, and nobody ever dropped the ball. Nobody ever blew it. I mean, yes, there was that episode at Hiroshima before the game was fully laid out, but that was not two equals confronting each other. That was somebody with a gun executing somebody who had nothing, relatively speaking. But the fact that we could come through the era of atomic confrontation without a thermonuclear exchange indicates, that under pressure we can pull ourselves and our institutions at least sufficiently together to avoid total catastrophe. Well, that was just a dry run for what lies ahead. More complicated problems, less easily managed, far more challenging. We are going to need a great deal of goodwill, many different sorts of viewpoints, incredibly integrative, technologies, very wide bandwidth systems of symbolic communication so that we all understand where we stand and what we mean. And all of this is the challenge of the extreme near term. I'm not talking about the next 500 years. When I get to that, I'll try to stand your hair on end. I'm talking about the next 10 years. The rest we'll save for later. So these are just some of the ideas that we'll cover this weekend. As I say, if you don't like what you're hearing, ask questions. And I steer easily, though I give long answers. If you didn't get one of these and you think you might be interested in this ethnobotany, ethnochemistry course at Uxmal in January, I brought extras.
Does that tend to sell out?
It does tend to sell out. So by October, November, you should be pretty much making a commitment. We can only take 100 people in each one. And people sometimes say, well, which one should I go to, the first one or the second one? I don't know. It's a hard call. The first one, everybody is pretty fresh and coherent. The second one tends to be somewhat more
Not fresh, not fresh.
yeah, thrashed and incoherent. So, and if you do come, you should certainly, if you've never done it, build in a week, one side or the other of this, to tour the Mayan areas of Mexico, which are immediately adjacent. If you haven't done that, it's one of the great archaeological experiences of the world. I mean, nowhere in the world is there so large a concentration of archaeology on such a scale and in such a state of preservation. Not Greece, not Egypt. Simply because the size of the Mayan world was immense, and there were many, many city centers, and it, was extremely historically persistent. People compare the Maya to the Inca. The Inca, that was a family. The entire thing lasted 135 years. The Mayan civilization arose in the 2nd century BC and blew apart in the 960s AD. So for over 1,000 years, it was a continuously evolving culture with literature, theater, mathematics, lineages, so forth and so on. So don't just come to Mexico for this. Mexico is an astonishing and bizarre culture, as exotic as India, as potentially as undoing as Iraq. So be forewarned, but have fun down there. Here's another piece of propaganda. I don't think I have enough for everybody to have one of these. So if you don't think you might be in Hawaii in November, it would be very hard for you to attend this, since that's where it's occurring. But this is an event. This is a whole bunch of people, a course, great diversity. This would just be me for 5 days. The perks are you get to stay in a Frank Lloyd Wright house in Waimea, which is a beautiful part of the Big Island. So if you think you might be interested, take one of these. Otherwise, pass it on. If there are any not used, you can hand them back to me. Okay. And then before we start this morning, I just wanted to, it's sort of become a ritual at these things, to briefly discuss relevant new publishing in the field, just to give people a feeling of what's out there that they might not be aware of. So much is being published that without some kind of vetting, it's hard to know what's what. So in no particular order, I guess from smallest to largest, here's some interesting new publishing relevant to this field. First of all, this book is just out in England by Paul Devereux, The Long Trip, A Prehistory of Psychedelica. And it just arrived in Paul's mailbox a couple of days ago, and he loaned it to me. It looks to me like basically a history of psychedelic use worldwide before the 1960s. Paul Devereux is better known for writing on earth energies, ley lines, and that sort of thing. But this seems like a pretty good book. So few of these books come out that, you know, the number of books that have been written on the history of psychedelics are probably, you can count them on the finger of one hand. My book, Food of the Gods, is in that category. It's available in the bookstore. So I should say are most of my books, and I'd be happy to sign books at some point. Not after this morning, because I have to run out of here to a meeting. But at other times, I'll be happy to sign books. Trying to think of other books besides this one and mine that cover this area. It's mostly, strangely, the publishing seems to be coming out of England on this subject, which is odd because the English contribution to the psychedelic phenomenon is pretty much restricted to the musical division. Speaking of the 60s, in other words, who can name a great English pharmacologist?
There's a good book, Storming Heaven.
Storming Heaven, that's an oldie. Yeah, that's by J. Stevens. And that's a very interesting history of the psychedelic movement. There's also LSD, the CIA, and the cult. Acid Dreams, LSD, the CIA, and the Cult of Intelligence. Is that what it's called? Yeah. Anyway, that's a more, if you tend toward conspiracy theory, I mean, I don't. Everything I know, Martin Lee, that book is quite true. Generally, conspiracy theory is a form of epistemological cartoon making that comes under the heading of simply damned foolishness and a ticket to irresponsibility. You know, the real news is no one's in control. Not the central bank, not the Jews, not the Communist Party, not the Pope. No. Nobody's in control. This is a book that's come out just in the past year, edited by Bob Forte. Some of you may know Bob. He's a longtime figure in this field, psychedelic activist and literateur. And this is a bunch of essays by some of the top folks. The title is Entheogens and the Future of Religion. And some of the contributors are Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD and the synthesizer of psilocybin, Gordon Wasson, our own brother David Stendelrast, who's lived and taught at Esalen many years, Jack Kornfeld, myself, Anne and Sasha Shulgin, and then some of the younger people, Robert Jesse and Tom Reidlinger, Rick Strassman. Very interesting book, probably a good buy for the money. I don't know if this is in the bookstore. It certainly should.
Does the book deal with the future of religion, or is that kind of the title?
No, it does. Some people discuss it more cogently than others, obviously, but it doesn't escape notice. This is a book more to be read for fun than to be taken seriously. I disagree with a lot of what's in here, but on the other hand, I've never seen this kind of stuff in print before. Again, what's going on in England? I don't know. While HarperCollins is chewing itself up here and Wired is going mad, English publishing seems to be getting some traction. The Post-Human Condition by Robert Pepperell. And this is sort of a parallel track to some of my thinking. If you cruise the net, you encounter people who call themselves transhumanists or extopians or this sort of thing. These are not psychedelic people. These are people with an enormously inflated faith in the power of human engineering. So these are the people who, want to dissolve humans into machines, build ring worlds, go nanotech, that end of the big picture. And Pepperell actually tries to produce what he calls a post-human manifesto, which is printed in the back as a series of statements. And actually, as I read through them, I disagree with most of them. I don't think that's how it's going at all. But this is sort of like an introduction to somebody's notion of the approaching chaostrophe. So that's that. And then the one which gives me the greatest pleasure to recommend to you, a book actually unambiguously worth buying, reading, and recommending, is Mason and Dixon, which is Thomas Pynchon's latest novel, certainly probably the best novel written in America in the past 50 years. I mean, Pynchon is the greatest living writer of American English. I wasn't sure about that till Wednesday, but Burroughs died, so it appears secure. If you've never read Pynchon, I wonder where you've been. But his novel, I guess, was it 17 or 20 years ago, Gravity's Rainbow, really codified a whole complex of social and aesthetic issues. This is a much different book. I mean, it's vintage Pynchon, but it's also a celebration of America and of the buddy system. And it's a scathing look at the embryonic birth of big science and big government projects. As you know, Mason and Dixon were an astronomer and a surveyor who accepted a royal commission to define the boundary between Pennsylvania and Delaware in the 1760s and cut a line due west into the unexplored North American continent. Later, that line, called the Mason-Dixon line, was the division between the Confederacy and the Union. This has nothing to do with the Confederacy and the Union. This is set in the 1760s, when America itself was simply a caffeine-driven hallucination in Philadelphia. It hadn't come into existence yet. But this book is about how people struggle with new technologies and revolutionary modalities in the evolution of society. So, enough of that. Okay. Well, hopefully, some of what was said last night either was odious enough that someone would like to pull us in a different direction, or perhaps to somebody else interesting enough that they would like to ask a question. What comes for you from last night? Anybody? As I said, these things are best driven by people's agendas. What's your agenda, Nicholas?
Well, what I thought about, or one of the things that made me think for a while after I left and as I went in and out of sleep, was the idea of artificial intelligence and what determines what is artificial, what is non-artificial intelligence, what kind of definition would define that, in a sense. Because my understanding of intelligence and consciousness being kind of a similar thing, depending upon how one defines intelligence. What is artificial? that's conscious and intelligent isn't as real as anything else.
Well, I'm sure, as some of you may know, that this issue arose early in AI. How do you know an artificial intelligence when you're talking to one? And Alan Turing, who was a theorist of cybernetics in the 40s, developed what he called the Turing test, Turing, the Turing test. The Turing test is if it walks like a duck, if it talks like a duck, it probably is a duck. And the Turing test is always imagined as a telephone conversation. I tell you to dial a number. You dial a number. A voice on the other end says, hello. Now the Turing test begins. Your job is to determine whether you are talking to a machine or a human being. If you can't determine it, it is an AI, then it's past the Turing test. And this was in the 40s and 50s a theoretical proposition. Now these things are actually done, and every year there are competitions where this is precisely how the game is played. And now it turns out that the more you restrict the subject matter, the harder it is to tell whether you're talking to a human being or a machine. If it's no holds barred general knowledge, most people can, within a few minutes, make a pretty good call. But intelligence is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, how do you know that I am not a cyborg? How do I know that you are not a cyborg? The answer is, well, we Turing test each other unconsciously at sufficient depth to satisfy ourselves. It becomes moot, or it is becoming moot. Big Blue is an example. You know, in terms of playing chess, it can pass any Turing test you can imagine, but it can't even formulate an answer to a non-chess question. So it's a very domain-specific AI, and really not an AI, because it's simply the world of chess. Chess is not like reality. Chess is a very high variable game system, but it doesn't have the open-endedness that reality has. You see, in really interesting games, the most interesting rule is that the rules can be changed. And chess doesn't have a rule like that. Did you want to say something?
Could you consider cloning another clone?
Yeah, I read in the New York Times yesterday they've got some embryos about to be birthed in the Midwest, 10 types of Holstein cattle. Cloning is one of those things. See, there's a whole bunch of revolutions all crowding onto the stage. The one that holds center stage at the moment is the cybernetic internet thing. But somewhat completely independent of all that is the biotech possibility, which is cloning, gene sequencing, getting a tremendous grip on curing hereditary diseases, that sort of thing. And then another area, not entirely connected or related, is nanotechnology, which is proceeding at breakneck speed. And the public relations machinery for telling the public what this isn't even in place. You meet people who are fairly established in their professions or whatever, who don't know what nanotechnology is, who in fact have never heard of it. I don't know if there's anybody in this room in that situation. And after what I said, it would take courage to admit it. But nanotechnology is simply the idea that one could conceivably, theoretically, build in the physical superstructure of our world in a completely different way from the atoms up. This is how nature does it, through processes of transcription of protein through ribosome or crystallization or this sort of thing. Nanotechnology envisions the possibility of abandoning agriculture on this planet within 20 years. Agriculture is, after all, an incredibly land-destructive process for the production of food. What we want is the food. The food could be produced directly out of available and extremely inexpensive elements. Seafloor sludge is the usual notion of how this is done. What the holy grail of nanotechnology is what's called a matter compiler. A matter compiler does to matter what an SGI graphics system does to images. In other words, anything you can imagine. Out of matter compilers come, in the case of agriculture, in Neil Stephenson's book, The Diamond Age, all of China is being fed out of matter compilers that are producing rice. And people say, well, this is hundreds of years away, thousands of years away. It's pure science fiction. No, it isn't. It's happening right now. And producing rice is a simple trick. What's imagined is that all kinds of machines of whatever complexity could become nearly invisible in size and nearly costless. Most things would be made of diamond. This is the trash material of nanotechnology. It's just simpler to build things out of diamond than anything else. Cheaper, faster, cleaner. And the huge amounts of R&D funding and enthusiasm are going into nanotechnology. And an interesting thing about it is it's not really being driven by managerial decisions. The reason nanotech is moving so fast is because all the best people think it's so cool to do it. You know, I mean, electric dynamos where you can fit 60 of them inside a human hair. A few years ago, this is how far nanotechnology has developed. Like 3 or 4 years ago, on the cover of Science News, there was a 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter chip that had 10,000 steam engines on it. It had more steam engines operating on it in this 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter space than were operating in all of England in 1850 at the height of the age of steam. Now, each of these steam engines produced 1/10,000th of a millinewton of torque. That's not a lot of torque, but on the other hand, it depends on what kind of work you're trying to do. If you're trying to kick atoms around, that's plenty of force. To return to the cloning thing, I'm sort of thinking of novels these days, or short stories, or plots, and I thought it would be fun to imagine a joint project between Esalen Institute and SRI, let's say, that would reach for, and this was to be the name of the novel, Cloning Buddha. I thought that would be interesting. I mean, why should the next Dalai Lama be anyone less than Gautama? After all, we have the tooth, so there is presumably sufficient tissue there, and we're not talking pterosaurs here. I mean, this is only 500 BC. And the interesting objections to cloning are some of them are removed in the case of Buddha, because people say, well, you know, even if you cloned Napoleon, it wouldn't be Napoleon, because Napoleon was a product of a unique environmental and social system, and he was the product of the experiences of his lifetime. But presumably Buddha was born Buddha. And so it would be very interesting to clone Buddha and to see what this child was like. This is not a practical suggestion. This is to horrify and amuse you and to make you think about the implications. I mean, there are other historical personages. I love the theological mess it raises, you know.
Maybe that's what the second coming is.
The cloning of Buddha? I think it's called Maitreya. Well, no. The Christians covered their bets on this one by having the body rise incarnate into the next dimension. Presumably there are no tissue remains around, although, you know, in a good Jesuit theology class, I'm sure you could get argument on this. You know, one of the great puzzles of Islamic theology is the fact that when Muhammad ascended into heaven, he did it on horseback. And the status of this horse, his beloved horse, who he loved very much, it has been maddening for Islamic theologians ever since. I mean, you know, if you think the Immaculate Conception is a problem, try taking a horse into heaven and see what problems you leave for your exegetes.
But their problems were compounded in the 60s when Trigger went up there.
Yes.
Actually, there are a number of shrines that claim to have part of Christ's foreskin.
Oh yeah, the Christ foreskin thing.
It didn't go, you know, it was circumcised. It didn't go
The
up
shroud
with
of
it.
Turin.
Well, this is material for a Tom Robbins novel. Definitely, I would yield to Tom on that one. But cloning, all of these things, I mean, will happen, are happening. I don't think the implications of them seem overblown in popular media. For instance, I'm old enough to remember, I don't know if it was the very first, but the very first publicly discussed and acclaimed sex change operations. Christina Jorgensen, wasn't that the person's name? I can't remember whether they went from man to woman or woman to man, but anyway, this was at early 50s, and people just, this is horrible. Well, now it's just, so what? You know, it's a dime a dozen. It's a medical procedure. You want it, you have it. Who cares? We don't convene medical ethics committees or philosophers to discuss what it means. Some technologies are more challenging, the ones that directly impact our consciousness. I think that's why the drugs and the communication technologies, cloning is something you will talk about with your friends. It will probably never come near you, or you'll probably have very little to do with it in your lifetime. But these communication technologies and these drugs are in your face, on your plate. You know, you are going to have to come to terms with them, even if you reject them. Even that is an enormous decision. I mean, I meet people who are rejecting the internet and computer connectivity and this sort of thing. And it's like a vow of abstinence or something. I mean, that's very quirky. It's like going orthodox or something. It's just bizarre. And it will affect their lives for the duration of their lives. And it's not easy to correct that decision because it's a decision made in a historical context. If you ignore computers for 10 years, you will probably never be able to get back online. Middle-aged people seem to have the feeling that there is no obligation upon them to self-educate and keep up. This is completely wrong. You just stamp yourself to utter irrelevance. Your rejection of these things will impact on no one's life but your own. So if you're doing it to be a politically correct example, you're pissing into the wind, I fear. People aren't interested in that.
Point of clarification on something, topic you brought up last night. Before I get into that, I'd just like to say that I thought that was interesting about cloning Buddha. Maybe this time the Buddha won't make ignorant statements about what Americans can do in their bedroom, about masturbation and about homosexuality, like the Dalai Lama did, very ignorant and uncompassionate, since he said it in San Francisco.
When was this?
I guess it was a month ago. There was a conference in San Francisco, and he had added against homosexualities and what was sexual misconduct and what wasn't. Masturbation was sexual misconduct. And he went into what holes you can put it in and what holes you can't. And he didn't qualify it.
That wasn't Buddha.
Well, wait a minute. But is this past the vetting of consensus reality, or has Barry been sniffing angel dust? Did this happen?
It's part of my job.
Well, I'm just surprised there hasn't been more discussion in the dining room here. I haven't heard. This is the first time hearing it. This is real time, folks.
There was a lot of discussion, and I think some ACT UP people and other people met with him after, his spokesman, and he kind of tried to back off and said, well, oh no, I would never say anything against gay rights. But he had to have it pointed out to him that it was a rather uncompassionate thing to say about homosexuality, given the climate of fear and homophobia in this country right now. But anyway,
well, I like the Dalai Lama. I'm friendly to Mahayana Buddhism, but I think it's preposterous for anybody to assume anybody else possesses greater moral superiority or intellectual depth than they do. The Dalai Lama has been remarkable for his ability to not put his foot in his mouth. It's interesting that it comes in this form and that we don't, it's not the usual case of philandering and whatever that seems to haunt these communities. I mean, I think religion in its public manifestations always presents a cautionary spectacle. I do not understand why people transfer loyalty to role models. You have to be incredibly naive about what people are to believe that a role model is in fact worthy, because people are just people, and there's no I don't see great differences in spiritual elevation among people. That's why lineages and all that seem to me just another form of foolishness. The mushroom spoke to me once on this subject many years ago and said, for one human being to seek enlightenment from another is like one grain of sand on the beach to seek enlightenment from another. It's a wonderful statement about our commonality. If you want to talk to the Dalai Lama, close the door of your bedroom and have a dialogue with the mirror. You're as good as the Dalai Lama, for crying out loud. Who could suppose otherwise?
Well, in his particular case, it seems to me he's the representative for a Middle Ages serfdom, where a third of the population of his country walk around in saffron robes, being fed by another half of the people of this country, and we
Goodness, you lock out the psychotherapists and heresy after heresy pours out. Congratulations. No, I mean, I think Tibet should not be ruled by China. I also think that God kings are a thing of the past. I'm against religious theogonies. I don't want to see Israel ruled by a bunch of mumbling Hasids either. It's fine, Hasidism, Mahayana Buddhism. These are fine things, but not to aspire to temporal power. Good grief. So, the Dalai Lama's reluctance to envision a democratic Tibet has caused me to not feel a lot of wind at my back to try and sort out that particular political catfight, which has been going on for centuries and centuries. I'm a Jeffersonian Democrat of some sort. I really believe that if it doesn't liberate and serve the individual, no matter how attractive it is, no matter how traditional it is, no matter how majestic its pageants, how high-flown its philosophy, it's probably a foot on somebody's neck in the real world, and I'm not interested in that. Well, this is very interesting. I'm not informed in it, but I'll bet it's really rolling the apple cart in all kinds of places. Some of you may have seen in Tricycle a few months ago, there was Alan Bediner, who just lives down on the cliffs here, in fact, who I'm having lunch with, is a very sincere Buddhist and a good journalist, and he took on the editing of a psychedelic issue of Tricycle.
What do you think of that issue in Smith?
Well, let me lay it out. It's well known that many of the movers and shakers in American Buddhism had their roots in psychedelics in the 60s. And so he wanted to sort of reprise that, and I did an essay, and some other people did essays. And I really looked forward to it and thought it would be a warm community building. This shows you how even at the depth of my cynicism, there is still a grain of naivete. I thought it would be a good thing. Well, they just completely just dumped on by all these people, and people wrote in who I have seen loaded out of their minds and said, this is terrible and this shouldn't be there. And I said Buddhism without psychedelics is armchair Buddhism. How can you possibly know anything about these modalities if you sit there shastras to the eyebrows and never actually push off into the ocean of mind? It's what it's about. That's how I've always seen it. Turned out people thought that was just benighted as a viewpoint. Shouldn't have even been allowed. Why do you let Terence McKenna have a public forum in the pages of this magazine? On and on and on. So then I realized, well, okay, this was a community just one over from our community that I thought we could surely build bridges to. We're all transcendentalists. We're all, all these things. Not. So once again, it was handed back to me on a plate how unwelcome the psychedelic viewpoint is and how uptight people get. And all those people who came to spirituality through psychedelics essentially turned it into well-paying careers as abbesses and monks and publishers and purveyors then of something which, having been raised Catholic, the smell of the incense, the heavy velvet, the tinkling of the brass, I didn't feel I'd moved far at all. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
It's an interesting topic, and isn't it true that there has been, with the coming of Buddhism in Tibet, even the Vajrayana model, which is pretty radical as far as teachings go in that mid-year, there was a suppression of the shamanistic religion and its psychedelic use. That's what I understood. It wasn't heavy suppression, but it was pretty much frowned on and tried to be.
Well, we don't really know, but it's certainly true. There was an autochthonous shamanism across the Himalayas. Buddhism didn't enter Tibet until Padmasambhava brought it from Udayana in 741. So before that, it was all shamanism. But all cultures overlay. I mean, I don't think Tibetan Buddhism has been more or less brutal than any other. If you read the secular history of Tibet, they were using artillery, these monasteries, against each other to settle doctrinal disputes as early as the 1720s. In other words, as early as they could get artillery there. As soon as they could get it, they used it against each other.
And not only that, what the followers of the Dalai Lama, I think you make a good point about blind worship of people like the Dalai Lama, where no one ever asks him hard questions. It's not him, it's kind of mentality you get in the followers. And none of them will tell you, I don't even think they know, but if they know, they won't tell you that if you ask, how did the Dalai Lama, was the Dalai Lama always the religious, the spiritual, and the secular or political head of his nation? Oh, I don't know. Well, as a matter of fact, he wasn't. Well, how did he get that way? Oh, we don't know. Well, the way he got that way was the fifth Dalai Lama got the Mongol troops on his side and took over at gunpoint.
Well, this is what I'm saying. The secular history of Tibet does not exhibit compassion, enlightenment, or anything else.
Found a way to go to the other side and get help and bring in and heal people with some kind of supernatural ability or ability beyond me with the bag of mushrooms and the mirror.
You mean, do people do it without recourse to drugs? No. What do you mean?
Use drugs or don't use
You mean, are there people of special talent and ability?
Well, yeah, but I mean, when I say special, I'm talking special.
You mean, are there people who violate the laws of known physics?
Okay, to heal. I'll take that one.
To heal, is that?
Yeah.
Well, maybe you don't have to violate the laws of known physics to heal. Well, this was really the question that drove my intellectual quest. I have always been interested in these things and had a great thirst for spiritual transcendence. But I don't know why. It never made sense to me to believe these things. In other words, though I was raised Catholic and as a tiny little kid introduced to the transubstantiation, the resurrection, these completely mind-befuddling notions, still I was also exposed to secular science, and so my method was always to ask hard questions. What can you show me? And I, as an 11 to 14-year-old, practiced ceremonial magic to no great avail, I might add. I had stories by Robert Bloch and H.P. Lovecraft to make me hope I might get somewhere, but all I ever did was incinerate a lot of rosemary and to alarm my parents. But I think that this question is hard to answer because we're not all living in the same world. I've seen confounding things, but very rarely. But truly they were real. They were so real that I believed them to be real. And I'm the toughest nut to crack I've ever met. But these breakthroughs into the super real seem to have certain qualities about them that make it very hard to do much with it. First of all, it's always unexpected. No matter how much you expect it, it's unexpected. No matter how hard you're scanning, it can come from behind. The other thing is, and I don't quite understand how this works, but it only happens when your guard is down. In other words, it always has a quality of, it always requires a certain quality of unconsciousness on the part of the experient. This is why I think beginners get so far. There really is something called beginner's luck. My daughter, who I haven't seen for a while, is coming today, and it caused me to think of an incident that happened to she and I years ago here at Esalen. And it's a story which makes no sense whatsoever, but it really, truly happened, as far as I can tell. But it has all the qualities that bedevil this kind of thing. And what it was I was, as I am now, scholar in residence. It must have been some 10 years or so, 8 years or so ago. So Clea would have been like 9, and I would have been 40. So we were both younger and more naive. And it was dinner time at the lodge, and it was this time of year and this time of weather. And the fog had been coming all day in and out in the garden. And it was, and we genuflect here, God love him, to Carlos Castaneda, it was that very strange time of day, which only lasts a few minutes between daytime and nighttime, the crack between the world, I believe. It's interesting in South America and also in Hawaii, at precisely that moment, every day, there are certain species of Lepidoptera that rearrange themselves. In other words, that come out from wherever they've been hiding for 24 hours, fly around furiously for 5 minutes, and then disappear again for 24 hours. But anyway, it was precisely that time of day, and the fog was coming in and out of the garden, and we were not in a mood for anything peculiar. We were intent on dinner, and we were walking the path through the garden, and suddenly, as this fog moved and cleared, coming down one of the rows was a bunny, a small rabbit, except that it had very small, short horns. Now, some of you may know the creature called the jackalope. The jackalope is a large jackrabbit with a pair of antelope horns, and it is a creature known only to exist above certain low-class bars scattered across California and Oregon. It's up on the wall, the jackalope. It's something you kid tourists with. As far as I could see, this was a baby jackalope about this high, and it crossed the trail no more than 5 feet in front of us. We both saw it, and our attitude was not amazement or an awareness that we were entering into a paranormal dimension. Both of us, I think our reaction was, come on. And then immediately behind it was a man, a very thin, not particularly healthy-looking man with a shaved head, wearing something like a gray running suit. And he was running crouched. He was with his hands out like this. He was trying to catch the jack-a-bunny. And when he saw us, he appeared very confused and stood up and turned and walked the other way. And I just took her by the elbow and I said, let's get out of here. And then we went to dinner, and we've talked about it immediately after and since. And as far as anybody can reasonably and decently tell, this is the straight story on what happened. Well, it doesn't make any sense. First of all, the Earth doesn't move from its pinions. But what does it say? It says that attention falling into a certain place of non-attention is set up for something like this to happen. And I can't explain it. I don't think it's explainable. It's sort of like, when you study quantum physics and they tell you that a black hole mostly puts out electrons, but the theory allows that it could eject Miatas and grand pianos, except that it would be very rare for it to eject a grand piano. But the theory does not preclude the ejection of grand pianos. So it's something like that, or it's a group hallucination, or it's a bewitchment, or, and it begins to proliferate. I was thinking about it last night or this morning, because I was in that place where I saw it happen. And I was thinking, maybe Esalen lasts a really long time. Like maybe it's sort of like the Piazza San Marco in Venice, or the Central Aryan Stonehenge. Maybe we're actually starting something here that will last so long that for the next 5,000 years, people will relate to the Esalen Garden, and that somehow it's a nexus for others on strange missions. Now, the other thing about that story that I like, or that relieved me, is I guess the way to put it, is notice that it's absurd. And by being absurd, it's self-canceling. Suppose instead of a jackalope, which is an absurd creature to begin with, suppose it had been a gray of the wraparound eye type that are apparently trading high technology to the government for human fetal tissue, those people, then you would have had a real dilemma on your hands, because grays are objects of cultural fascination. In other words, if you see a gray, you just become part of a statistical body of people who've seen one. And so it's like more problematic. It's not that it's a non-reality, it's that it's a sort of a non-reality. This is, I think, part of the clue to understanding alien abductions and the way we generate information. If I tell you that I was up late last night and couldn't sleep and walked along the cliffs over Esalen, and that I encountered a shining disk, and that I then had my navel lint was removed by a team of extraterrestrial cosmetologists. This is evidence for an already existing body of data. If you say, well, you should call MUFON, they'd be very interested in this, or you should call somebody else. If I tell you I was restless last night and walked the cliffs of Esalen, and that I encountered Bugs Bunny in the company of Patrick Swayze, people would just say, you're nuts. It's not sanctioned. It's not allowed. And nobody gives a hoot or takes it seriously for a moment, because it serves no one's agenda. It's just insane data and should be immediately tossed out. This shows us, that the objects in the unconscious are given different weights, and you can tell a crazy story and join a self-help group, but if your story is too crazy, They won't have a group for you. They'll have a cell for you. So it's worth bearing in mind. Let's be generous here. Someone had prepared a bunny with horns to surprise someone else with whom they'd had a lifelong running joke about jackalopes. And they had arrived at Esalen for the surprise birthday party of this person and realized that the bunny was frantic because it hadn't eaten on the long trip. So they took the jack-a-bunny in its cage down to the garden to steal some lettuce for it. And in the fog and in the effort not to be seen, the bunny escaped with its horns in place. And this person, who probably didn't have a gate pass anyway, could see the whole situation getting out of hand and was frantically trying to capture the horned bunny and get it back in its... See people say, gee, what a party pooper this guy is. Well, yeah, but we're trying to save the laws of physics and reason here, for crying out loud. But I have to tell you, that doesn't feel right to what it is. It felt to me like, I don't know, we all live in private Idahos. And somehow I was in somebody else's private Idaho for a moment against my will. But I think we should always prefer the simplest explanation. Sometimes the simple explanation, like in a case like that, is maddeningly complex in itself. But if you don't believe that's what's happened, well, then what do you believe? Do you believe that mythological animals are a potential infestation problem in the Esalen Gardens? Or just where do you draw the line? You know, if you want to know, like if you have a simple scientific question that you want to answer, like let's say here you have a wire and you want to know how much current is flowing through the wire. So you measure it with a voltage meter. And if you're doing it scientifically, you'll measure it 1,000 times. Then you'll add those numbers together. Then you'll divide by 1,000. Then you get the voltage running through the line. Well, now, it's not uncommon when you carry out this procedure that 998 of your measurements will tell you that between 4.5 and 6 volts are running through the line. But 2 of your 1,000 observations will tell you that 75 watts in one case, and in another 240 watts are running through the line. When a scientist looks at this series of measurements, the first thing they do is say, well, look, there are 2 anomalous measurements. Everything else was fluctuating between 4.5 and 6. These were way out of scale. Throw them out. Get rid of that. There's something wrong. That's bogus. Can't be. And then you get the voltage running through the line. Now, we do it in the sociological domain in the completely opposite fashion. Tonight, 1,000 people or more, just I'm picking a number, will stare at the night sky and see what has always been there. 2 people will see mile-long spacecraft with violet running lights and accompanied by strange music and a message for mankind. Now, what should we do with these 2 out of 1,000 people? Should we put them on après? Should we rush their story to the cover of every tabloid outlet on Earth? Or that's what actually happens. In other words, in the sociological world, we seek to amplify novelty because we're fascinated by it. But then we get false readings of reality. because we've raised the, we've made the novelty stand out too much. The fact is that information is a degradable medium, and it collapses into contradiction and absurdity often. If you analyze your own conversation over a course of a day, it's largely grunts and nods. We don't really engage for verbal communication all that much of our waking time, and yet we assume that we're doing it constantly. And so, I think reality is very slippery, very malleable. I think we're very naive about what information is and how it works. I've been interested in, as a lens for this phenomena, in crop circles. Crop circles are the con that will not die. No matter how many people come forward and admit that they've made them and fully confess, the meme is launched, and tours go from L.A. taking the cognoscenti of the City of Angels to visit the crushed wheat of Devon, and then draw conclusions from it, and yet the phenomenon has been completely deconstructed to the satisfaction of anyone interested in its deconstruction. It just turns out a lot of people aren't. Extrapolating from the crop circle thing, the way reality seems to work is we have a self-observing system of media, newspapers, television, so forth and so on. Something strange happens. A block of ice falls in a field, a peculiar pattern in a crop. A frightened rural person has some kind of strange experience. The local press prints this. Then people called stringers cull that local press environment for interesting stories. In other words, stories that people would be interested in Argentina and Australia, just for their weirdness and their human interest. So they carry then the flying saucer, the block of ice, whatever it is, goes on to the Reuters network and UPI and this sort of thing. Well, then you and I, reading our daily dose of media, the New York Times, whatever it is, so you're reading even the New York Times, page 43, 1 inch of print, it says Hertfordshire, England. A block of ice was reported to have fallen on the home of Herbert Surrey. Well, so you think, that's interesting. Let's see how my Adobe stock's doing. What's Dilbert up to? And you, in other words, it's nothing to you. But of the millions of people who will read the New York Times, some few will say, this dovetails with the astrological calculations I've been doing recently, and my recent, and this theory I've had, and this piece of data is important to the construction and maintenance of my worldview. So they drive there, fly there, go there to this place. Well, now, the only other human beings who are interested in this phenomenon at this point are journalists. And journalists, God bless them, have to have a story. So if your editor says to you, a block of ice has fallen on a farmhouse in Cheshire, go get the story. You drive out there, and of course there's nothing. there's now a mud puddle, the block of ice, having been bottled for its curative powers or whatever. And there's nothing there, there's no story, except that the person who resonated with the phenomenon has also arrived at the site. This is where the marriage in hell takes place. The press meets the nut over the corpus delicti of the anomalous event. And the press guy says, my God, we drove miles to get here. I'm on deadline. There's no story. There's no picture. Who are you? To the person in resonance with me. Say, well, I'm Dr. So-and-so of the Advanced Institute of Auric Physics, which I founded, and I've published numerous books, all of which I self-published, and I'm very close friends with Terence McKenna and the Dalai Lama, and I know what's going on here. And say, okay, what's going on? Say, well, this is cosmic retribution for our polluting of telluric energies, which are under the keeping of the elf kingdoms, and until we begin to retract our emissions of sulfur, and the guy is writing furiously, and then the story is amplified and circulated again and again and again, and it begins to have implications for more and more people who are seeking evidence for some squirrely or peculiar viewpoint. In other words, it becomes a body of evidence, and then there's no end to it.
It sounds like an explanation for all organized religions.
I don't distinguish. I think I was when the Heaven's Gate people exited the scene, I was amused by the tone of the rhetoric in the press. It was all about how could people believe such a weird rap? Now, excuse me, I have to get dressed for Easter midnight mass. You know, we're celebrating the resurrection of the Savior. A minor Galilean politician who became God focuses my attention, and I barely have time to cluck over the foolishness of the Heaven's Gate people. People are not playing by the same rules in all these areas. I mean, what is it?
Or with the same decks.
Or with the same decks, that's right. And so people say, well, that's tried and true Christianity. What does that mean? A delusion grows more real over time? That's a peculiar notion. Pliny the Younger, there's a fascinating book published in the last couple of years called The Christians as the Romans Saw Them. Fascinating book, which translates the early texts of the Roman Imperium as it slowly became aware that this strange phenomenon was in its midst. And Pliny the Younger, not the naturalist who was the elder, but Pliny the Younger was appointed governor of Armenia. And his job was to go out there and administer Roman law and so forth. And he wrote extensive letters to the emperor, who was his very good personal friend, about the problems of administering this area. And his letters back to the Roman administration are the first records we have of Christianity. They were being oppressed. They were on some piece of land. And some townspeople, they were like gypsies, I guess, and some townspeople had moved them off this piece of land, and they had petitioned to the governor for redress of grievances. And in the course of settling this, he had inquired of their beliefs. And then he wrote a letter to the emperor, and the emperor was quite interested and wrote back and said, "Tell me more." And he said, "Is this a new religion?" And Pliny the Younger wrote, and he said, "No, this is not a religion. Religions are concerned with the great issues of cosmic fate and cosmic destiny. This is a cult of Christ. It's a cult of personality." And this was actually the earliest take on Christianity by non-Christians, and I think, examined fairly. I don't hear cult as the hammer word some people hear, but it is a clear distinction between religion. Religion is sort of the imperative branch of philosophy, how you should live based on the nature of being and the world. A cult is just a squirrely bunch of ideas based on the power of some personality or some revelation. I don't know how we got off onto all of this. Probably Barry's evil and manipulating influence in the background somewhere. Yes. Thank you for asking. See, I don't carry on this kind of debunking stance from a point of view of somebody who's never had these experiences. I have had these experiences. I mean, in my book, The Invisible Landscape, I describe encountering a flying saucer right down to the point where I could see the rivets. But in a way, I saw too much. Or I kept my head, because I went through all the emotions of the standard UFO encounter. In other words, awe, paralysis, acceptance that it was going to take me. But as it kept coming closer and closer, and I saw more and more of it, I could finally see that it was, in fact, the end cap of a 1937 Hoover vacuum cleaner that was about 45 feet across. And if you're a flying saucer enthusiast, you know the famous George Adamski photograph of the debunked photograph that shows the end cap of a 1937 Hoover vacuum cleaner, which he suspended on monofilament line in his garage and then shot with his Brownie. It's the famous flying saucer with the 3 half circles on the underside, the little round portholes, and the twiddle on top. I saw it. Flying through the skies of the Amazon, going whee, 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 whee. And as I saw it, I knew what it was. I knew that it was the phony saucer. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. What it is, and Jacques Vallée and other people have written about this, the encounter with the UFO or with the other always has an element of self-canceling absurdity in it. If the witness can be fully honest and can give a full account of what happened, the story will not make sense. It never makes sense. And in my case, it didn't make sense on the spot. Now, my conclusion from that and from the encounter in the Amazon, and I guess this maybe goes to your question about supernormal power, there is something loose on this planet, is that what I want to say? Or behind reality? Or something? We could call it the unconscious, but that might make you feel more comfortable with it than you should. But what this power can do is it can manipulate your mind. And what it has access to is the complete contents of your experience. It has more access than you do you, the ego, are a fragile and forgetful creature. This thing, every movie you've ever seen, every television show you've ever watched, every headline you've ever glanced at, every face you've ever noticed in a crowd, it has it all. And when it sits across the board from you and the pieces are displayed, it absolutely surrounds and encloses your mental universe and can manipulate you any way it wants to, because it knows you far better than you know yourself. As an example of this, because it's very hard to catch this thing in action, it's Mercury sly, but it's not perfect, it's not godlike. It's just 99.8% able to do this trick without ever being nailed to the wall for it. Here's an example of the 0.02% where it failed. And if this seems to make no sense to you, you should read my book, True Hallucinations, in which the story I'm about to tell is embedded. But my brother, to shorthand it catastrophically, went pretty bananas in the course of this expedition to the Amazon. And at one point he announced that he was going to deliver a teaching that would, I think this was the one which cured all disease. You only had to do this practice and all physical disease would instantly be cured. And he said, and so here's the practice, he said, picture the number 8, turn it on its side, slide the 2 circles together, shrink it to a point, close your eyes, and utter the mantra, please. Okay? Sounds like it has a 30-40 chance of at least knocking back hay fever, right? So this was at a point in this experience in the Amazon where he had been raving for days and days, and just everybody was exhausted and at their wits' end, but it was like a bolt of lightning to me, because I remembered that 3 months before I had been in Canada, having come from Japan, and was getting ready for this Amazon expedition. And one of the things that I thought I should take care of, since I'd been in Asia for a couple of years, was I needed a dental checkup. So I made an appointment with this Canadian dentist and went for this dental cleaning, and arrived to find a waiting room full of people and settled down to a tall stack of tattered and incredibly tatty magazines, among which was the Journal of the Canadian Education Society, something like the Parent-Teacher magazine, but for Canada. And there was an article in there that said, this was 1971, shows you how things never change. There was an article about how computers will soon revolutionize elementary school teaching. And so, in desperation, I turned to this article, and here's this article. You can imagine what it was saying. But there was this little sidebar next to the article, and it said, the schools of the future will be nothing like we have known. Children will learn in completely different ways. And then it said, imagine little Susie sitting down in front of a computer screen, visualizing the number 8, turning it on its side, sliding the 2 circles over each other, and shrinking it to a point in order to command an arithmetic operation or something like that. And it was like nailed. We know where this stuff is coming from. It's coming from our own minds. You know, he, if we want to blame my brother for this, had apparently a complete readout of all this detritus flowing around in my mind and could pick it up and use it at will to befuddle and confuse me and lead me deeper in. So when people say they have these encounters, the strangest thing about how we relate to the encounters is that we believe them. We take it at face value. If you told me, if you stopped me in the dining room this morning and told me that you had culminated an incredibly intense affair last night, I would not take that at face value. I would wonder at your motivation for revealing such an intimate detail of your life to someone you hardly know in the inappropriate venue of the Esalen dining room, and without us having previously discussed your erotic proclivities at all. I would say to myself, what a weird thing. Why is this guy telling me this? In other words, I would not take it at face value. These encounter things people take completely at face value. And yet they are the most suspect accounts any of us produce. The people who have these experiences take it at face value, and then the people who listen to the experience take it at face value and say, well, let's go out and measure. Now, you say you were standing here and it came over the trees at this angle, so you say it was the size of a football, but the tree was in front of it, so that means by the rules of optics that it could have been no more than 15 feet across, no less than 3 feet across. In other words, they treat it like it's science. Like this is, we're supposed to, deconstruct this and find out the nature of the object. You wouldn't subject a dream to that kind of analysis. That would be absurd. These things are like dreams. We are dreaming most of the time. The idea that there is a shared reality, the idea that you and I are living in the same universe, seeing the same things, walking on the same ground, is just a very high-level philosophical abstraction. It's very hard to prove it, or even to convince yourself that it's so. We live inside worlds constructed by our language, our history, our expectations. And when the unconscious, for some reason, becomes, as the Jungians say, activated, it moves into that world and it uses the entire stage of being to send messages back to you about reality. And it's an intelligence test, is what it is. It's an intelligence test. And if you take things at face value, for sure you failed the intelligence test. It's no game for the naive.
Based on foolishness, or is it based on stupidity?
Sometimes one, sometimes the other. If you can't help yourself, I guess it's stupidity. If you can help yourself and you make the mistake anyway, I guess it's foolishness. Yeah.
Is there any purpose to this? I mean, is it a personal thing, a personal unconscious?
You mean, why is it doing this?
For educating us?
It seems like it's educating us, but in a funny way. You know, if you read Jung on alchemy, alchemy is like this. It's a paradoxical realm of symbol structures that seem to contradict themselves and myths that don't make any sense. But what it always is about, I think, is dissolving assumptions. That's why the people who take it literally are, in a sense, victims of it, because it was not to be taken literally. the intelligence test is failed. You know, the flying saucer enthusiasts love to say, I don't know what the number is, they keep pushing it up, but they say 35% of the American public believe flying saucers are real. Well, now, first of all, are we being asked to believe that 35% of the American public can carry on a coherent discussion of the concept real? You know? As real as what? As real as Madonna's talents? As real as Clinton's integrity? How real are the UFOs? And to my mind, then, if 35% of the American public believe the UFOs are real, and they aren't real, then obviously the interesting population to interview is the other people. What do they think? Well, the UFO people will say, oh, well, they just think they're weather balloons, or they think that it's government aircraft, or... No, don't let your opposition speak for itself. I'm in that larger percentage, and I don't think UFOs are weather balloons. I don't think they're government aircraft. Obviously, all the interesting explanations lie on the side of that they are not what they appear to be.